I'm Mary Beth Tinker, and I'm going to talk to you about a case called Tinker versus Des Moines Independent Consolidated School District that was decided on February 24th, 1969. It's a youth rights case, and the main idea of Tinker is that you have a right to speak up about the issues that affect your lives, and that youth have a right to weigh in on those issues and also to affect what happens in decision-making about those issues. And I was one of 3 plaintiffs that were involved with the case, as well as my brother John and a boy named Chris Eckhart. So there were 3 plaintiffs, but there were many other students involved with the case, some planning it and others wearing the armbands. Less than 10 students ended up wearing the armbands. It was in Des Moines, Iowa, and 5 students were suspended. Even some little kids wore the armbands, like my little sister Hope, who was in 5th grade, and my little brother Paul was in 2nd grade. But it was a landmark decision when it was decided, and some of the famous parts of the ruling by Abe Fortas at the Supreme Court, which decided by 7-2, said that neither students or teachers leave their constitutional right to expression at the schoolhouse gate. And one of my favorite parts of the ruling is that students are persons with the rights and responsibilities of persons. But the ruling says that there are 2 things that students cannot do with their free speech rights. 1, substantially disrupt school, and that comes directly from the actions of African-American students who stood up against racism in 1964 and won their case. And I'll talk to you more about that. That's called the Burnside case, which basically set the standard for free speech in a way, even before us, because they won their case because the appeals level said that they had not substantially disrupted school. But the Supreme Court in Tinker said there's another thing that students cannot do with their First Amendment rights, which is to impinge on the rights of others, whatever that means. And it's been debated ever since. Well, we wore our black armbands to school in 1969 to mourn the death in Vietnam on both sides of the war. And that's probably what made it so controversial. Well, that was partly what made it controversial. And also to call for a Christmas truce that year. It was 1965, and the war was building up. There had been about 1,000 US soldiers killed. Eventually, there would be over 50,000 US soldiers directly killed, and many, many more indirectly, and 3 to 4 million Vietnamese. So us kids, we were very, very sad about that, and we didn't know what to do about it. But our actions, when we decided to do something about it, were we were on the shoulders of young people through history who have stood up and spoken up about different things. And some of them were in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. When I was 10 years old, there was an amazing effort by Black students in Birmingham, Alabama called the Children's Crusade. They were speaking up and marching against racism. They were kind of the Black Lives Matter of 1963. And we saw them on the news, and we thought they were so amazing and brave, especially when the white supremacists, the white people there in Birmingham who didn't want there to be racial justice or equality, they started attacking the students with fire hoses, and the dogs, the police put the German Shepherd dogs on the kids, and it was horrible. And we saw this on the news, thanks to the free press. We thought those kids were so brave and strong, and they inspired me. A lot of the students that wore the armbands, they had various reasons for doing that, but for me, I was definitely inspired by these students and so many that came before us. But in Birmingham, Martin Luther King said that those kids were the turning point of the civil rights movement, and they certainly were a turning point for me, just knowing that those kids were so brave. Well, the white supremacists, that fall of 1963, the Ku Klux Klan, they were leading a terrorism, history, and it had been going on for many years. And so to continue it, they decided to do something against those kids in Birmingham, and they put a bomb in their headquarters, the 16th Street Baptist Church. So I had just turned 11 years old when someone came by our picnic and told us what had been done to those children, and that 4 little girls had been killed in the bombing. Cynthia, Addie Mae, Carol, and Denise. And we were so sad about that. And that year, a man named James Baldwin, I know you've heard of the writer James Baldwin, and a man named Bayard Rustin, who was a real leader in the civil rights movement, they had an idea. What if people would just wear black armbands to mourn for the little girls and to say that we are going to do something about this and that we don't accept the way that things are going and that the white supremacists are being violent and killing Black kids just because they're speaking up for racial justice. So that's what we did in Des Moines. We wore black armbands that year, and there were memorial services all over the country for these little girls. And that was our first experience with black armbands. And then the next year, young people spoke up again against racism. This time it was called Freedom Summer, 1964. And hundreds of students went from all over the country. They were called to Mississippi to help register African-American voters. And when they got there, 3 of them were immediately killed by the white supremacists again. And all of this was going on at the same time in those mighty times that are so much like now, when you have a lot of things going on also in your country and in your world. But that year, 1964, Freedom Summer, when the 3 civil rights workers were killed, James Chaney, Mickey Schwerner, and Andrew Goodman. When the FBI found their bodies on August 4th, 1964, the very same day off the coast of Vietnam, a US Navy ship claimed that it was attacked, the USS Maddox. And it turns out it had not been attacked, but it didn't stop the US Congress from voting almost unanimously in the Gulf of Tonkin resolution to start sending thousands more US troops to Vietnam. So all that happened in 1964. And then by 1965, Christmas time, us kids were seeing on the news just the horrific images of the war, the bombing of the huts in Vietnam, and the children running from their huts screaming. And there was something called napalm, which is a chemical warfare. It was produced in Michigan. It's like a jelly that was dropped on the villages of Vietnam, and it's a sticky gel that burns and you can't just wash it off. It was made by Dow Chemical Company. And we were seeing all this on the news and we were feeling worse and worse. It's really a story about young people speaking up and taking action about their feelings too. Because we heard that people were going to be wearing black armbands again, but this time to mourn for the dead in Vietnam and to support a Christmas truce. And so us kids, we thought that would be a good thing to do that Christmas, a way to speak up about something we cared about. But when the principals heard about the plan, they made a rule against armbands. And so then we didn't know what to do, and a lot of kids decided not to wear the armbands. But I thought about those Birmingham kids. I thought about my parents were also examples to us for people who speak up about what they believe in. My dad had been a Methodist minister, and he said you should put your ideas into action and your values into action. And so I went to school and I had a black armband and I was really scared and nervous, and I got suspended for doing that. I was in 8th grade. I was 13. It was 1965. It was at Warren Harding Junior High School. The next day, my brother John got suspended. 5 kids got suspended. And some people got really mad at us for doing that. And they said, you kids don't know anything. Well, some adults like to say things like that. But as it turns out, the adults really didn't know much about Vietnam either. But one group that helped us was the American Civil Liberties Union. And they have been around for 100 years. And their whole thing is standing up for your rights. And so they came and offered to help us kids because they said that the First Amendment has been violated. And the First Amendment is a way that groups that have been disrespected and exploited and discriminated against through our history, whether it was African Americans, Native Americans, women, immigrants, and now kids. It's a way that these groups have stood up and stood up for their rights and to be not exploited, not discriminated against. The First Amendment, the right to free speech, free press, the right to assemble, to petition the government for grievances, and for the right to have your own religion, and for the government not to tell you what religion you are. So the ACLU said they thought that that had been violated and the kids should have rights too. So they came and offered to help us. And they said, first you have to negotiate, which we did, but the school board wouldn't change their mind. And so they said, well, we're going to have to take this over to the other branch of government because the schools, the public schools, are in the legislative branch. So there's 3 branches: legislative, judicial, and executive. So they said, we think the Constitution has been violated by the legislative branch, your schools, and we're taking this over to the judicial branch to check it. And so that's what they did, and they started a lawsuit. Our case lost at the district level, and then we lost at the appeals level in Iowa, the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals. Well, right before we lost, over in Mississippi, the case that I told you about, Burnside, where the students spoke up against the Ku Klux Klan and racism, and they spoke up against the killing of Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman. They won their case. They had worn buttons to school saying "one man, one vote" to protest the white supremacist murders in Mississippi, and they won their case at the appeals level. And the appeals court said they had not substantially disrupted school. So now you have 2 appeals courts that are saying different things about youth rights. In Iowa, we lost, but in Mississippi, the kids won. And so it was appealed to the Supreme Court, which takes very few cases per year, but they took our case. And then in 1969, amazingly, the Supreme Court ruled by 7-2 that yes, you do have First Amendment rights in public school with those limitations that I named: cannot substantially disrupt school or impinge on the rights of others. And all of that, what that means and what cases do violate the rights of others or amount to substantial disruption has been debated ever since. But I grew up and I became a nurse and I started working with kids. I saw that kids don't really have a fair deal in our society. They are the most likely to live in poverty, you, young people. It's not because you don't work, it's because as soon as your parents have you, they're more likely to live in poverty. And there's so many homeless kids, and there's air pollution and water pollution, all these issues that affect your life. So I started traveling around and hearing about the ways that kids are speaking up and standing up today. And it's been so wonderful to see that students are basing a lot of it on this case and on this example of young people speaking up for their rights. And I want to be an example for you to speak up about the issues that affect your lives. And I'm so glad that so many of you are. So here's to the First Amendment. Here's to the First Amendment. And here's to young people who speak up and use it and change the things that need to be changed.